In this video, we'll discuss occupational segregation. This chart shows the distribution of men and women by major occupation in 1970 and 2011. So the way we'd read this chart is 13.6 of all employed men were working in management, business, and financial operations occupations in 1970, whereas of all employed women in 1970, only 4.7% were employed in management, business, and financial operations occupations. We can rather broadly separate these occupations into white-collar positions, farming, fishing, and forestry, and then blue-collar positions. And we can see that men choose to work in blue-collar occupations at much higher rates than do women. And this has been fairly consistent across time. We've also seen a decrease in the percentages of both men and women working in production occupations, so manufacturing and whatnot, between 1970 and 2011. Over time, we've seen a decrease in the gap between the percentage of men and the percentage of women choosing management, business, and financial operations occupations, from a gap of about 9 percentage points to a gap of just over 2 percentage points. We've seen actually an increase in the gap between men and women in professional and related occupations, from women choosing these professions at just over 3 percentage points more, to almost 9 percentage points more, or actually just over 9 percentage points more. We've seen a decrease in the gap between the fraction of men and women in service occupations, and a decrease in the gap between men and women in office and administrative support occupations, with a decreased percentage of both men and women in these office and administrative support occupations relative to other positions. Then, as I said before, the fraction of men and women choosing to work in these various blue-collar occupations has been fairly stable over time, except for in production occupations, and the percentage of both men and women in production occupations has decreased between 1970 and 2011. Lastly, farming, fishing, and forestry occupations, a very small percentage of both men and women are working in farming, fishing, and forestry occupations, and there have been small decreases in the percentage of men and women choosing these positions between 1970 and 2011. So we can actually measure the level of occupational segregation using an index of segregation. This index of segregation tells us the percentage of female or male workers who would have to change jobs for the occupational distribution of the two groups to be the same. So basically, the percentage of female or male workers who would have to kind of change their jobs for those two columns in a given year to be the same, from the last graph. So in 1970, the index of segregation was 64.5% in the U.S. There were pretty large decreases from 1970 to 1990, and there have been much smaller decreases from 1990 through 2009. And in 2009, the index of segregation was 51%, or 51, which means that 51% of female or male workers would have to change jobs for the occupational distribution to be the same. So to calculate an index of occupational segregation, we take 1/2 times the sum over I, where I is an occupation, of the absolute value of MI, where MI is the percent of males employed in occupation I, minus FI, where F sub I is the percentage of females employed in occupation I, and we can close that absolute value. So essentially what we're doing here is if we think back to that last table, we're subtracting the number in the column to the left in a given year from the number in the right in a given year, taking the absolute value and then adding together all those differences across all rows or across all occupations, and then dividing by 2. So here I've taken the table 7-1 and those more narrowly defined occupational categories and combine them into white collar, blue collar, and farming occupations. And so using this condensed table, we can calculate the index of occupational segregation. So remember, it's 1/2 times, and we're looking at the rows, so the difference between, here we have MI and FI. So we're adding up the absolute value of all of these differences. So we have the absolute value of 65.8 minus 93.8 plus the absolute value of 33 minus 5.9 plus the absolute value of 1.1 minus 0.3. And we'll divide all of that by 2. This gives us 28 plus 27.1 plus 0.8 divided by 2, or 55.9 over 2, which is 27.95. So using these very broad occupational categories, 27.9% of either male workers or female workers would have to change jobs in order for the occupational distribution to be the same. So like we saw in the last slide, there have been decreases in occupational segregation since 1970. And this decreased occupational segregation is happening for 2 reasons. The first is that the sex composition of individual jobs is changing, so more females are doing traditionally male-dominated jobs and vice versa. But also the occupational mix of the economy is changing. So over time, the occupational mix in the U.S. has shifted from being very manufacturing heavy to being more service and white-collar job oriented. So due to that decrease in blue-collar jobs, which are traditionally male-dominated, and an increase in white-collar jobs, which typically have more females, we've also seen this decrease in occupational segregation. So not only do we see men and women tending to be employed in different occupations in general, so in different fields, this is what we call horizontal occupational segregation. But we also see men and women being employed at different levels within occupations. So this is what we would call vertical occupational segregation. So an example of horizontal occupational segregation is how we see more women in the professional and service jobs, and more men in the management and financial operations occupations positions. If we look within those occupations and look at kind of the types of jobs that men and women are holding within these different fields, for instance, we might see more males in upper management or in like CEO positions than we see females. That's vertical occupational segregation. An example in the context of academia, if we look at the percentage of professors at different ranks that are female, we can see examples of both horizontal and vertical occupational segregation. So this chart shows the percent female at various levels by department at UNC. So for instance, in economics, we have 22.22% of assistant professors are female, 22.22% of associate professors are female, and only 16.67% of full professors are female. And these are what we call tenure track jobs. So for your professors, professors come in as assistant professors. They stay at the assistant professor level for about 5 to 7 years, and then they go up for a promotion to associate professor. And usually, associate professor comes with tenure, which means you can't be fired without cause. It gives you more academic freedom. And then, again, 5 to 7 years, or perhaps never. You don't have to go up to full professor, but the next promotion would be from associate professor to full professor. And then at UNC, there's a parallel teaching track, or you might hear them called fixed term faculty. So teaching faculty are not on a tenure track, or they cannot get tenure. We have contracts. But we come in as assistant teaching professors. After 5 to 7 years, we can go up for associate teaching professor. And then after 5 or 7 more years, we can go up for full teaching professor. So within the economics department, 50% of assistant teaching professors are female, 2/3 of associate teaching professors are female, and 100% of our full teaching professors are female. So that's actually about to change, well, not change very drastically. But Rita Balaban was the only full teaching professor, but Geeta Vaidyanathan just was promoted to full teaching professor, and I was just promoted to associate teaching professor this year. So that's exciting news within the economics department. But if we look across all departments, we can see that in biology, the percentage of assistant professors and full professors who are female is slightly higher. But if we look at something like the School of Media and Journalism, even physics and astronomy, political science, public policy, romance studies, sociology, these fields have much higher fractions of female professors. But across most fields, what you do see is, those are examples of horizontal occupational segregation. But across most fields, what you do see is that as you move up in rank, there are smaller and smaller portions of those professors that are female. So for instance, if you take physics and astronomy or the School of Media and Journalism Studies, 66% of assistant professors in the School of Media, Journalism and Media are female. Only 40% of associate professors are female, and 50% of full professors are female. Or you can kind of see a similar thing with economics. But this is the idea of vertical occupational segregation, and that kind of refers to the glass ceiling, which you'll watch a video on for the problem set and reading guides. So if you have any questions about this material or comments, please feel free to post those on the Course Campus Wire site.